1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 3 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. Once again, I am on video as well as audio. So if you're listening to this on the OWS podcast feed and you want to see my face in a box, you can go to the 1 week season YouTube feed. If you are listening to this on YouTube and you want to find it on podcast, just search 1 week season on your podcast player of choice. Same caveats as last week. If you listened last week, solo show on video with no pauses. So last week was pretty smooth. Got into the groove. But again, early season, not a lot of practice. So bear with me if I kind of lose my place in my notes. We should be good to go, though. Before we get started on what's a really unique slate, and a slate where we definitely have pretty significant edge over time. Now, pretty significant edge over time. Remember, if you're newer here, what we're talking about in DFS, we're never talking about picking players. We're never talking about predicting what's going to happen. What we're talking about is proper roster construction that maximizes our chances of first place finish. I talked about this in Winner Circle this week. I talked about it on my show with Pete Overzet today. But I've had 8 or 9 weekends over the last 2 years where I've had first or second place finishes. So 8 or 9 weekends out of whatever, and I don't play every NFL weekend. So 8 or 9 weekends out of whatever that is, like 32, 33 weekends that I've played NFL DFS with first or second place finishes. And none of those were weekends where I would credit just being better at picking players for the main reason I won tournaments that week. There was probably about half of those weeks, us being better at picking players or game environments was a big part of it. And then the proper roster construction component was what allowed me to jump ahead of other people who also were targeting those games or those players. And then probably the other half of the weeks were literally just due to proper roster construction theory and strategy and how we put those together. So again, remember, it's about rosters. It's not about players. And then also, we're not trying to predict what's going to happen. We're trying to understand the range of probabilities. So for example, last week, week 2, that was one of the most plus EV weekends we'll see this year. And what I mean by that is if we could have played out that slate 100 times, we would have made a lot of money on that slate because of the way we were attacking the Rams offense and the way we were building around that Rams offense. But in a small sample size of 1 week, the Rams offense ended up being the reason why many of us didn't have a shot at first place in contests. And so I didn't have Kamara last week, but obviously Marvin Harrison Jr., one of my highest owned wide receivers, Malik Neighbors, my highest owned wide receiver, lots of other mix and matches around my core that hit for high ceiling. And so I had like all the right mix and match pieces, but my core was what ended up failing me. But again, if we could play that slate 100 times, we would have made a lot of money on that slate because of how uniquely plus EV that particular setup was and the way that we were able to attack that setup was. So just because a slate is plus EV for us does not mean that we are definitely going to make money on the small sample size of one slate. There are also slates that we come across throughout the course of the season where we're like, you know what, this slate is a really tough slate and doesn't necessarily play to our favor. And sometimes those weeks, we still end up having our biggest weeks at OWS just because of the way that things shake out. So there are weeks where our probabilities of winning a lot of money are lower, higher, and it doesn't always work out that way. But this is one of those weeks where we definitely have high probability of making some money because of the way that this slate shapes up and because of some of these specific unique components about that we're going to talk about in this podcast about how the NFL is playing football right now, how that relates to DFS, and how we can be ahead of the curve on those types of things. But before we dive into all of that, wanted to bring this up. Splash Sports, Survivor Pools. As you see, we have, 8 out of 115 in our $100 Survivor Pool, 54 out of 600 in our $10 Survivor Pool. So, excuse me, heading into week 1, we had this one was sized at 100. This $100 pool was sized at 100, and we got 87 entries. So I bumped it up to 115 entries, thinking that we would get more this time around. This one had the $10 3 max had 487 or 421 entries, something like that. So I sized it up to 600, thinking that we would get more people who got knocked out. A lot of people have been knocked out of these Survivor pools, thought they'd be coming back, and new people would be coming in. Still a lot of spots left. So Make sure that you hop into those. Lots of fun to just be doing these survivor pools together as the OWS fam. If you don't have a Splash account, it takes like 30 seconds to sign up. So well worth it to hop in there. And congrats to those of you who are still around. I think there's 20 of us left, 21 of us left in the $100 survivor pool, Bengals and who was the other one that Bengals and Ravens, Bengals and Ravens really knocked a lot of people out weeks 1 and 2. So not a lot of people left in those. So we'll see, might scoop some extra money in those, and we got some more coming up. Okay. So today, the first thing I want to talk about is the shape of the NFL and how this relates to, I'm going to do something else at the same time as this, but how this relates to actually I won't do something else at the same time as this, I'll save that for later. How this relates to DFS. So I'm going to go through like a little bit of a history lesson, and this is valuable to understand where we're at right now and how we want to attack the NFL, how we want to attack our rosters based on how NFL teams are playing. Seattle cover 3 defense. We actually touched on this a week or two ago in one of my podcasts, and it was just kind of off the cuff, and I hadn't really spent a lot of time thinking about it, but the Seattle cover 3 defense was all the rage for a little while. And so we have to understand that a lot of and this is, I think it was a Winner Circle podcast, and I talked about sometimes when we talk about, these coaches don't know what they're doing, it's like, who are we, right? We're sitting here on the couch in our offices, whatever, breaking down games and saying, these coaches don't know what they're doing. They're professional coaches. They know what they're doing, right? But I go back to Richie Incognito was on Julian Edelman's podcast a few weeks ago, and he was talking about how refreshing it was to play for John Gruden, because John Gruden, it was like, we're going into the game with this plan, and if they have a plan for that, then here's what we're going to do next. And then if they have a plan for that, here's what we're going to do next. We're always adjusting. Or Bill Belichick talked recently about how, they were asking about halftime adjustments. And he said, really, the fourth quarter is its own game. And Pete Carroll talked about that a lot as well. The fourth quarter is all situational. It's its own game. And this, we see these coaches who lose a lot of games in the fourth quarter. Nick Sirianni, unfortunately, John Harbaugh, who's a tremendous coach and has had a lot of success with the Ravens, but has always kind of struggled in the fourth quarter compared to a lot of other good coaches. Andy Reid for a long time had a hard time in the fourth quarter. He's gotten better and better at that. But that's its own game. Kind of like how the Patriots, for a long time, Josh McDaniels designed the offense. Chad O'Shea designed the red zone offense, right? They took that off Josh McDaniels' plate. They said, Chad O'Shea, you handle this stuff. Those are different things, right? And so fourth quarter is its own thing. And the game is really, it's 3 parts. It's the first quarter, the second quarter, and the third quarter. So if you wait till halftime to do your halftime adjustments, well, the game is already the game is already 2/3 of the way over. It's not halfway over, it's 2/3 of the way over. So you really got to start making your adjustments at the end of the first quarter. And so good coaches think like that, right? And Richie Incognito was saying that when he played for the Dolphins under Joe Philbin, that really failed stint there with the Dolphins, he said, it was with Philbin, it was like, here's our plan. And if the defense has an answer for that, it's like, well, that was our plan. That's what we're doing. And so a lot of times these owners are hiring, it's not the coaches who don't know what they're doing, right? These coaches are good at the systems that they run. Or I was listening to some Jay Gruden stuff yesterday, and like Jay Gruden coached under John Gruden in Tampa for 7 years, and that was his playbook. That was how he understood offensive football, right? And so when Jay Gruden went to Cincinnati as the offensive coordinator, I think he went to college first for a year or two, and then went to Cincinnati as the offensive coordinator. Like that was his entire perspective on how to run an NFL offense, was this West Coast offense that Jay Gruden had picked up from his time in San Francisco. And then you have to develop that over time because the NFL develops, right? How good are you at adapting and developing? And Jay Gruden, saying that he really liked getting younger coaches who had coached in other systems because they were able to consistently bring new things to the table that he didn't know about and kind of incorporate that into his system. But a lot of these coaches haven't had that, right? And so these coaches are really good at one thing. Maybe that's one scheme. And then they have success, and owners just see, well, this guy's had success, and they hire them because not all the owners really understand exactly what they should be looking for in a coach. And so the Seattle cover 3 defense was tremendously successful. And if you don't know, that Seattle defense, the basic component of it was we don't change anything. No matter who we're playing, we don't change anything. Richard Sherman got a lot of flack throughout his career. Like, how can you say he's the best corner? He doesn't even travel with the other team's best receiver. He always stays on his side of the field. Well, that was a function of that defense, the way that defense was played, the way that defense was called. And the thought was every single day, this guy's going to practice on the left side of the field. every single day, this guy's going to practice on the right side of the field. And they are going to do that day after day after day. And they're going to get so good at it that you have to come and beat us. You have to come and beat our scheme where all of these guys, and a lot of defense is communication and these guys playing on a string together. And, the offense is doing this. And therefore I, as the free safety, know that the strong safety is going to do this and the right corner is going to do this and the left corner is going to do this. And that means I'm supposed to be right here because this is the space that's now being left open for me to cover. And so these guys would practice that day in and day out, and they played so well together and were so talented and good that was a really tough defense to move the ball on. So you had Richard Sherman, you had Cam Chancellor, you had Earl Thomas, you had Bobby Wagner, you had who was the big cornerback who played for the Patriots as well, whoever he was. And so it was like you had this great defense that was really uniquely equipped to be a great defense based on the talent that they had. But then you had, Gus Bradley got hired out of that system to go be head coach and with the Jaguars, and Dan Quinn got hired out of that system to go be a head coach with the Falcons, and Chris Richard or Richard, whatever his name was, he got hired somewhere else, and Ken Norton Jr., I believe, came out from under that system. And there's like a lot of guys who started spreading throughout the league with that system, and that was the system that they knew, but that system worked because of the pieces that they had in Seattle. And when you get out of Seattle and you don't have those elite pieces running that defense, well, now you're just a team that does the same thing every single play, and the defense knows exactly what to attack, and it's not going to look pretty over time. And so that for a long time, that Seattle cover 3 was the defense that was stopping opponents. And so a lot of the teams that this defense started spreading throughout the NFL, and that defense was a defense that was capable of inviting downfield passing, right? And so then we got these teams that started developing their downfield passing, and downfield passing became a huge part of the NFL game. And we had these teams that had, really started adapting this Seattle 3 scheme that had kind of spread throughout the NFL, and they didn't have the talent for it. And so offenses were really winning the battle against defenses for the most part. So then defenses, because the passing attack was doing so well, defenses started adapting more to being able to stop the pass. So we started seeing a lot more nickel packages as the base defense, right? There's not a lot of teams that have run like a true 4-3 or 3-4 as their base defense with 4 linebackers on the field or 3 linebackers on the field. And then furthermore, a lot of the linebackers shifted over. You didn't have the Brandon Spikes and Dante Hightowers as much anymore. You really had these kind of more space eating linebackers, the Devin Whites who can move around and ideally cover guys and do everything, right? Because a lot of the game is going to be passing, and you need linebackers who can play well in space and really handle that. So defenses started shifting over to that. And then over the last couple of years is when we've seen this, prevalence of cover 2 defense. And so cover 2 defense is where you're putting, 2 men deep, and you're really going to force the opponent to work underneath. And every coach, every quarterback, what you'll hear them say is really the best way to beat cover 2 is not to try to design cover 2 beaters. The best way to beat cover 2 is to run the defense out of cover 2. When you're in cover 2, you have lighter boxes, and now especially with the lighter boxes and the lighter linebackers who are not as equipped to stop the run. Well, if you can run the ball really well, now you force the defense to come down. And obviously we think through the lens of fantasy. It's like, well, why are you running the ball? You're not scoring as many points that way. But as we've been talking about this season, if you're an NFL coach, if you're an NFL player, the game of football is not about scoring as many points as quickly as you can. The NFL game is about picking up first downs, right? If you can pick up first downs and then mix in some chunk plays, you're going to win games. If you can keep the ball, drive the field, and the best quarterbacks over time, whether it's Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, Drew Brees, Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, these guys are excellent at picking up first down. So regardless of what their weaponry is, you put Brady, maybe not with the Patriots' current offensive line, but you put Brady in with the Patriots' current weapons, and the Patriots should be a much better offense than they are with Jacoby Brissett. Little side story there. I watched the Patriots Week 2 game against Seattle on Sunday, and then switched over to Red Zone channel after that, or maybe I switched over to a different game after that. And I literally went and checked to see if I had some setting weird on my TV that was playing that second thing I switched to at like 1.5x speed, because it was so much faster than that Patriots offense looked with the slow old Jacoby Brissett and slow wide receivers and what they've built there. So, but you put a guy like Tom Brady on that offense, they would look much better than they look because he's so good at just staying ahead of the chains and picking up first down. So you give him Randy Moss, or you give him Mike Evans, and he's going to be able to hit some downfield plays. He's going to pick up those chunk plays, loosen up the defense. Then it's even easier to move the field. But all teams need to be able to move the ball. This is why, there was like the pump the brakes on Caleb Williams things, because it's like, yes, he can do great things out of structure, but 90% of football is not doing great things out of structure. 90% of football is keeping the offense on track, staying ahead of the chains, picking up first downs, marching the field. And that's what makes Patrick Mahomes so special, is he can do this stuff out of structure, but he's also Peyton Manning, Tom Brady level, or at least very close to that level, at just staying ahead of the chains, keeping the offense on track if he's not able to pick up chunk plays, driving the field. So defenses started shifting to more cover two. And the way that you beat cover two is by, running the defense out of cover two. And most teams had built more and more for the pass over the years. And so they weren't really capable of running defenses out of cover two. At the same time, defenses have added a lot more disguised pressures and disguised looks and simulated pressures and all these different things that young quarterbacks are not really equipped to deal with. So take Brian Flores, for example, who's obviously like the top end of being able to do this. But take Brian Flores, defensive coordinator of the Vikings, former head coach of the Dolphins, who's with the Steelers last year, is kind of like a senior consultant / linebackers coach, I think, for them on defense, and obviously started out with the Patriots. But Brian Flores, what he's able to do is, the quarterback, most good quarterbacks who can read the defense, they know what coverage they're facing before the snap. And then the ball is snapped, and they take a quick snapshot of the defense to make sure that everything that they were seeing pre-snap is what is in fact in place post-snap. And then they know exactly where to go with the ball, like what their reads are going to look like and what they're going to do from there. Well, a lot of what the Vikings are doing is pretty basic, like zone two coverage, cover two zone, and occasional blitzes, exotic blitzes and whatnot. But like a lot of what they do is just pretty straightforward defense, but they muddy the picture, something that Rex Ryan used to do as well. They really muddy the picture pre-snap, so the quarterback has no clue pre-snap what it looks like. And then he snaps the ball, and then he has to figure out where all of the defenders are going and what the coverage is. There is no, okay, I know before the snap, the ball is snapped, now double checking to make sure, and now I can move through my progressions. It's, okay, I have to figure out what the defense is doing, and then I can move through my progression. So it causes them to hold that ball for that extra quarter of a second longer, extra half second longer. That throws off the timing on, especially these timing and rhythm-based offenses like the Shanahan offense, the Shanahan tree, those timing and rhythm-based offenses. Throws it up, but also gives a chance for the pass rush to get there because the quarterback's holding the ball a little bit longer. And so, we're seeing that, which is also throwing off offenses. So how do offenses combat that? Well, what we started seeing is teams are running the ball more, right? So over the last couple of years, teams were in this passing mode because of the defenses that had pervaded the NFL, and obviously the quarterbacks who we had. We had Mahomes, we also, Drew Brees was still playing. Peyton Manning, I guess he retired 6-7 years ago, whatever that was, but Tom Brady was still playing, and we had all these great quarterbacks. Phillip Rivers for a little while, still healthy and playing, and Ben Roethlisberger, like these guys who had played for a long time, had all the knowledge. Maybe the arm strength was declining in different places for different guys, but they were still like, these guys were able to handle what the defense were giving them. Well, now the quarterbacks have skewed younger and younger because all of those kind of long-time dominant annual Pro Bowl quarterbacks are out of the league or are now backups. And so this has kind of shifted everything into the defense's favor. And these offenses have now been built for passing. So over the last couple of years, teams have started to think more and more about how they build for the run game. So teams are running the ball more, passing is down. And a lot of these quarterback stat lines that we see through the early portion of the season, a lot of them look like two games of football. I mean, like one game of football. These two games of football look like one game of football. So Justin Herbert, Justin Fields, a couple of good examples, Derek Carr, like these guys who through two full games have 39 pass attempts, 43 pass attempts, 36 pass attempts, 350 yards and a couple touchdowns. It's like, oh, that looks like a 60 minutes of football line from 5 or 10 years ago. And now that's 120 minutes of football. And that's leading to the average scores on DraftKings and on FanDuel being lower for wide receivers and for quarterbacks. So actually, let me go ahead and read through some of these average scores. So we're going to skip the top end guys, right? CeeDee Lamb's averaging 16 points. This is just through 2 games, but CeeDee Lamb's averaging 16 points. Justin Jefferson, 21 points a game. Tyreek Hill, 18. Amon-Ra St. Brown, 15. Cooper Kupp, even missing half the game and not being effective the other half, averaging 21. A.J. Brown scored 25.9 in his first game. Then we get down to these cheaper guys, right? So let's get down to Chris Olave and below, 6,300 and below. Chris Olave through 2 games, averaging 8 points. We have DK Metcalf, 18.9. Brandon Ayuk, 6.6 points. Keenan Allen, 6.9 points. He only played 1 game. Michael Pittman, 6.1 points. Amari Cooper, 3.9 points. Jalen Waddle, 13.9. Calvin Ridley, 16.4. Jaden Reed, 21.4 with that huge week 1. Jameson Williams, 20.9. How are people not on Jameson Williams this week? We'll talk about him a little bit more later. George Pickens, 9.2. Romeo Doubs, 9.1. Brandon Cooks, 9.1. Jackson Smith and Jigba, 15.3. Cortland Sutton, 5.7. So you kind of get the picture, right? It's like a lot of these guys are averaging single-digit points through 2 games. Now, that might not hold for the entire season, but that is illustrative of what we're seeing across the NFL. Is just like the scoring from these quarterbacks, these passing attacks is down. The production is down. So now over to the quarterbacks, starting from the bottom. Will Levis, 11.6. Daniel Jones, 12.6. Gardner Minshew, 13.4. Justin Fields, 11.7. Sam Darnold, one of the outliers down here at 18.3. Deshaun Watson, one of the better guys at 14.1. Geno Smith averaging 19.9. And Caleb Williams, 8.3. Justin Herbert, 11.7. Matthew Stafford, 13.2. And again, this is kind of what we're seeing at the quarterback position is a lot of these 10-point games, a lot of these wide receivers who are putting up single-digit games. And so this is all a function of how the NFL has developed over the years from what was the popular defense, what shouldn't have been the popular defense, what then allowed teams to be attacking downfield at a high rate and sharpening this downfield passing attack, which then led to these defenses really adopting cover 2 largely across the board. We talked 2 years ago when this became a big topic of discussion of like, cover 2 defenses and teams can't beat it. And it was almost like cover 2 was some brilliant scheme that nobody had come up with before. And we talked about, there's a story from the 1980s where maybe it was the early 80s even, where Nick Saban and Bill Belichick, who'd already been friends for a while, and they were each coaching for different NFL teams, and neither of their head coaches liked their assistants fraternizing with coaches from other teams. And so Belichick and Saban went to upstate New York and got this rented a little cabin, just the 2 of them, so they could spend 3 or 4 days together in a place where no one would recognize them, just breaking down cover 2 defense together and essentially talking about what are the strengths and weaknesses of the cover 2 defense? If we were offensive coaches, how would we be attacking this? And so then therefore, what are the weak points of the cover 2 defenses for our defenses? And that's the 80s, right? And you had the Tampa 2 that it's the late 90s, early 2000s. They went and won the Super Bowl with that dominant defense. And cover 2 has been around a long time. And it's not something that people haven't figured out how to beat. It's that the NFL teams have started building for this downfield passing. And now all of a sudden teams were like, oh, well, why don't we stop the downfield passing? And now they're not equipped to run us out of this. And they're not equipped. These quarterbacks are not equipped to march the field because they've been in college where they don't have to do that. And then these NFL quarterbacks for several years have not had to do that. So these teams these offenses have all had to adjust to this cat and mouse game between offense and defense, which has kind of put the defense in the driver's seat for a little bit. So now we're seeing much heavier run volume. I believe last year, who was it? Last year, there was one team in the NFL. It was the Falcons. There was one team in the NFL that ran the ball more than 50% of the time. A couple of years ago, I think there might have been 2 teams. Right now, there are 6 teams that are running the ball more than 50% of the time. If we went back to like 5 or 6 years ago, there were no teams that were running the ball more than 50% of the time, and maybe none that were running it more than 55% of the time, right? So teams are starting to adapt and adjust. And so we're seeing the running backs become more valuable to the modern NFL offense than they have been for a while. But then we go over to something else that we've talked about over the years, because again, we always want to understand what the trends are in the NFL and how this relates to our own rosters and our DFS play. So years ago, Le'Veon Bell emerged. And if you weren't around watching the NFL playing fantasy during the Le'Veon Bell era, like you might not realize what a weapon he was. I mean, he would get 11, 12, 14 targets per game. That's why even now when I see these running backs kind of priced in like the close to 9K, and it's like, we don't remember what this used to be like. It's like, oh, this guy gets 5 targets a game, 6 targets a game, and he gets all the carries. It's like, yeah, he's putting up 30 points from time to time. But like Le'Veon Bell, it was like this dude got a wide receiver's workload, and he would flex out and run routes from the slot. He had lots of schemed routes out of the backfield. And then the Cardinals, David Johnson had been a wide receiver, I believe, early in his college career, and transitioned over to running back, but had this wide receiver skill set. And the Cardinals started using David Johnson that same way. And the price tags on those two guys just couldn't get high enough. And that was where Levitan coined Team Jam 'em in, where it's like, just find a way to play these two guys and then figure out everything else from there. And other teams saw that and they were like, man, this is so valuable, right? So Christian McCaffrey came into the NFL in a similar role, and Alvin Kamara came into the NFL in a similar role. And Todd Gurley, never had quite that pass game involvement, but he'd see the 5 to 6 targets, and then he was the every down back. And so many teams started getting these every down workhorse backs. And then these guys got to second contracts. Saquon Barkley was another one of these guys who was developed to be exactly this type of player. And then these guys started getting second contracts, big second contracts, and getting hurt. And so teams started realizing, oh, that's not where we want to invest our money. And this was still in an era where passing was dominating defenses and passing was dominating the NFL game. And so why invest this much in a running back? Who's going to be our do-it-all running back and then potentially get hurt? So over the last couple of years, we've talked a lot about how NFL teams have there's very few true workhorse running backs left. And a lot of the true workhorse running backs that we have are Jonathan Taylor type running backs who they might get 2 to 3 to 4 targets a game, but it's not really schemed targets. They're not trying to use them like an extra wide receiver. It's just, sometimes they catch some passes, and they're really good at running the ball. And so it's harder to pay those high price tags for those guys, but then also on the lower price tags, nobody's getting just massive workloads. You're kind of getting guys across the board who are seeing 15 to 17 touches, and you got the occasional 25 touch week. And people think, Ramondre Stevenson week 1, Joe Mixon week 1, where these guys get 25 plus touches. And it's like, oh, this is going to keep happening. And then the next week you find out, oh, that was a 1 week thing that they saw that many touches. You see a lot of these Aaron Jones situations where it's like, okay, we want to keep him healthy for the whole season. So Ty Chandler's going to get a big chunk of the touches there. And so we see a lot of these backfields that have done that. So what has happened is running back the running back position has become that much more valuable to NFL teams, but individual running backs are still devalued because of that whole wave that the NFL went through of how they were viewing individual running backs. So now teams are having less success passing. A lot of teams are passing less. Passing yardage is way down. Teams are running the ball more to try to beat this cover 2 defense, but then they're not just running it with one guy to help us in DFS. They're kind of splitting these touches among other guys. And so what we're seeing is that the opportunity for fantasy points is down. And that means, and this is what all of this is leading to, what we want to really be thinking about, and especially this week, because some of the unique components on this week, that means that separator scores in DFS now separate that much more than they used to. Because the average score you're going to get by just closing your eyes and picking a starting player from a bucket, right? The average score you're going to get just by randomly picking guys is going to be lower than it used to be. So we saw it in week 1 where you're finishing near the tops of tournaments with like 156 points, 162 points. And then week 2, we had the Kamara game. We had Marvin Harrison Jr., both of them low owned. Then you had Neighbors at high ownership. So you had some individual big scores, and therefore we had, you had to score 200 plus points to win a tournament. But if you went down farther down the leaderboards, what was finishing in that 70th percentile, that 60th percentile of scores was still way lower than what we're typically used to seeing, because the separator scores are separating that much more. Furthermore, these separator game environments are going to separate that much more because, as we know from the last couple of years, scoring is down across the league, and that is going to continue until this next wave of the cat and mouse game plays itself out, right? Where teams are running the ball more and more, and then defenses have to start adjusting to that, adjusting their personnel to that, and then all of a sudden you've got, oh my gosh, you've got these big linebackers, and you got these teams that have built themselves to stop the run, and they're playing to calling defenses that stop the run, and the coaches who are getting head coaching jobs or defensive coordinator opportunities throughout the NFL. They're getting these because they get successful stopping teams that were playing a particular way, And now teams are going to start playing another way, right? So that might be 3, 4, 5 years from now that all of a sudden it's like this explosion of passing across the NFL. And at that point, we're going to go through this whole thing again and talk about this wave of what's happened over the last, at that point, like over the last 15 years and how that relates to us in DFS. But players that can separate, game environments that can separate are that much more important. And then this week is so interesting in that the value on this slate for DraftKings is so outrageously thin. So we always say that anytime you get a 30-point score, it's valuable regardless of what you pay for it. But there's also the caveat there of what did you have to sacrifice to get that 30-point score? So on a week where there's, no matter where we're at in the season beyond like week 1, there are going to be cheap pieces that you're not going to feel super confident. Like most of the cheap pieces, you're not going to feel super confident in. But there's usually a pool of cheap pieces that are capable of putting up 20 points. And you mix and match these cheap, high upside wide receivers, and you're going to have somebody who ends up putting up 20 points, right? So you mix and match 7 guys, and maybe 3 of them just completely bomb, but they cost you 3,300, and so it didn't kill you that much. And then another 2 guys end up putting up a solid score, like 8, 9 points. And then you have a couple guys who put up 20, right? And those 2 guys who put up 20, maybe it's just one guy who puts up 20, and he's on only 8% of your rosters, right? But people don't have him, and he put up 20 points at a $3,300 price tag, and you're now so far ahead of the field because you got a 7x salary multiplier from this guy, and you got your 30+ points from the high-priced guy that you paid up for. What we're looking at this week is there's not a lot of cheap guys that you can paint a picture of them going for more than 3x to 4x their salary. So what happens if you get the cheap guy who goes for 4x his salary? Okay, he costs $3K, he puts up 12 points. That doesn't win you a tournament, but it keeps you on pace for 200 points and allows you to pay up for this high-priced guy. Well, most of these high-priced guys, because of the way that defenses are playing passing attacks, so at wide receiver, and then because of the way most teams are handling their running back situation, so over at running back, it's very rare that these 8K guys are going for 32 points. It's very rare that these 8,500 guys are going for 34 points. It's that they're getting up to that 28, 29, 30-point range, right? So they're not typically even going for 4x their salary. So you really start falling behind if you get that 3.5x from your expensive guy, and then that 3.5 to 4x from your cheap guy. But then there are going to be wide receivers, for example, or running backs in this 5K to 6K range who actually go for 4.5x, 5x. And then the person who just built the, let's just say that some of these guys hit, right? Like that built the Zach Charbonnet plus Jordan Mason plus Jameson Williams plus, let's take some other popular guys this week, whether I'm on them or not, the DK Metcalf, the Deontay Johnson, they put them all onto a roster together. And in fact, if you spend 8K at defense and tight end, 8K at defense and tight end, which is reasonable, right? That's actually kind of more than the expensive end. You have exactly 6K per player left on the rest of your roster. So you could build, one of these 5,500 quarterbacks or 5,900 quarterbacks, and then a bunch of these, low 5Ks to mid 6K wide receivers and running backs. And a lot of these guys have potential to go for 25 to 30 points. Well, what if we have a week like that, right? And then the people who carved out all this movement of their salary in order to get up to Tyreek Hill because they thought that was sneaky with Skylar Thompson under center, or to get up to Justin Jefferson, or to get up to CeeDee Lamb. If those guys only go for 30 points and the cheap guy only goes for 10 to 12, you're pretty far behind. So when we are looking at a site like this with unique pricing like this, what I want to think about, well, one, I want to consider some flatter build structures, some builds where I am kind of focusing more on that mid-range, or where I'm getting up to one of these high-priced guys, but without having to go way down in the salary pool to like a super cheap guy. And where I go up, I want to make sure that it's guys who are capable of putting up 5x their salary. So that doesn't mean they're going to, but if I'm paying for Alvin Kamara, right? Can Kamara go for 37.5 points? Well, he did it just last week, right? So there you have a guy who you're like, he's probably not going to do it back-to-back weeks, but you have a guy you're like, all right, that's within his range of outcomes. Can CeeDee Lamb go for 40+ points? Well, he did it 4 times last year. He did it in 3 times at home last year, I think it was. He and Dak combined for 5x or more their salary of this week, twice last year at home. Okay, so he's a guy who can actually justify that. Can Justin Jefferson in this game environment with Sam Darnold? Well, then you have to ask the game environment question, right? Like, can Justin Jefferson just do it if this is, a 21-18 game where Bobby Sloat, just like Kyle Shanahan has back-to-back years, has a hard time with this Brian Flores defense and understanding like how he can use his scheme to break through what this Brian Flores defense does. Can CJ Stroud read this defense more quickly than Brock Purdy, who, Brock Purdy obviously doesn't have all the tools that CJ Stroud has, but one of his tools is being able to read the defense really quickly and understand what he's seeing and make good decisions. And, he's had real trouble with this Brian Flores scheme, and CJ Stroud's really good at that stuff as well. So maybe CJ Stroud breaks through and Nico Collins hits for some big plays, and Nico Collins is going for 35 to 38 points at a little over $7K in salary. And that forces Justin Jefferson to have a big game response. He puts up one of these 200 yards and touchdown type games. But I don't want to just play Justin Jefferson isolated and be like, oh, hopefully he has a big game. Hopefully he has 30 points for me. On a typical week, I might be very comfortable saying, hey, hopefully Justin Jefferson has 30 points for me, because 30 points is always valuable. But given the nature of salary structure this week and what we're seeing across the NFL, I want to make sure that I am paying up for guys who are capable of completely separating. And if I'm paying up for those guys, I want to also account for how they would be capable of completely separating. So Cowboys being a unique situation. We talked about this in DFS interpretation this week, but the Zay Flowers has never topped 25 DraftKings points. In the regular season, he's never topped like 22.1 or 22.3, something like that. He had 24.9 in the playoffs last year, but he also has 20 plus DraftKings points in 6 of his last 9 games. So you don't necessarily want to pay, $6,800, $6,900 for him and get 17, 18, 20, 22 points. Well, that's not great, but he's also consistently getting those 20 points lately, which is taking away points from other guys on that Ravens team. So there is a scenario in which this Cowboys-Ravens game could be a shootout. We've also seen the Cowboys, by the way, Cowboys scored 30 or more points at home last year in all but one game, playoffs included. They scored 30 or more points in all but one game last year. So Cowboys are obviously capable of winning in a blowout. Probably won't happen against a good Ravens team that's 0-2 and desperately needs this game. But there's potential for this to be a shootout, for the Cowboys to score over 30 points, and for none of the Ravens to necessarily be pieces that you needed on your roster. That's less likely to happen in the Vikings and Texans game. In the Vikings and Texans game, if it's a game environment that leads to Justin Jefferson putting up 40 points, there's going to be somebody on the Texans that's also putting up a huge score that corresponds with that. So we want to be thinking about that on a week like this. Is you want to get the guys who can separate. And that's at every position. And we always want to think that way, but also we're typically in this mindset that is very sharp of saying, look, if you can get 30 points, don't worry about what you're paying for it. As long as you're not making huge sacrifices elsewhere, don't worry about what you're paying for it. 30 points is always valuable, but this is a unique week. Given the context of everything we talked about, the way the NFL is playing and all that, then also the pricing and the structure of this particular slate and what's available from a value perspective, this is a unique week in which I want to be even more cognizant of that than normal, that I want to make sure that I'm only targeting players who have that true separator type potential. And if I'm playing them, I then want to think about what would need to happen in order for them to have that separator type score and build my rosters accordingly. And then again, game environments that have separator type scores. We want to me this week, there's potential for any of 3 game environments, potentially all of 3 game environments, to just be way above all the other games, right? To where we have 12 games in the main slate. So there's potential for us to have like 9 games. Let's say Vikings and Texans has a combined score of 45 points. And then 8 other games have combined scores of 42 or fewer points. And then these 3 games have combined scores of 52 or more, or 2 of these 3 games have combined scores of 52 or more, and maybe one of them has a combined score of 60, right? So if all the games are like 2/3 of the games are 42 or fewer points, and then there's like a little bit in between, and then 1 or 2 games that are 55 or 60 plus points, those 2 games are going to separate so much from the rest of the field. And so the score required for a first place finish might look like a normal NFL weekend, but you might actually be finishing just outside the money with like 160 points, right? Which would typically not be in the money on a weekend where 200 plus points are required to win a tournament. So those games, pretty obvious, are Saints and Eagles, Cowboys and Ravens, and Cardinals and Lions. So I will touch on those in the player grid. I touched on those in DFS interpretations. So you can find kind of deeper thoughts from me on those things. And then just like the way I defined this was look to maximize the ceiling accessed when spending at the extremes. So that means at the low end of the price range and the high end of the price range, look to maximize the ceiling that you're accessing, especially on this week. So again, it's a little bit harder on the low end because there's just not a lot down there that looks like it go for 20 points. Everything comes together, nothing on the low end is going to be predictably 20 points, but there should always be a couple players down at the low end where you're like, this guy has pathways to 20 points. And if I pick 7 guys from this pool, most weeks, one of them is going to hit. And then a couple of them won't kill me. And then the others, they're going to put up a dud, but like I can still win because, all the things you talked about. But if you're just getting 30 points, if you're targeting guys who have no potential to get you 15 plus points at the low end, and if you're targeting guys at the high end who everything comes together and they might get you 30, you're going to be way behind. I never like saying things definitively, right? Because small sample size of 1 week, crazy things happen. When we play at the state 100 times, you would be way behind the field trying to build that way. So think about maximizing your ceiling at the extremes, just kind of a unique way that we need to be looking at things. Okay, last up for the Angles podcast, we're going to do the bottom-up build. Before we do that, I want to share something with you guys real quickly, and this is I don't know if we've ever looked at this on the podcast before. This is, first off, OWS Discord, which you can find on the site in the NFL drop-down menu, the OWS drop-down menu. You can find OWS Discord. If you're not on there, we have like over 5,000, maybe over 6,000 users on there at this point. And obviously a lot of our team members are on there, really sharp, incredibly sharp community we have at OWS. So be on the OWS Discord. Like I said, over 5,000, maybe over 6,000 users on there. It's always active. But this is the Props Insider channel. And what I would just want you to see is we talk about it all the time. I want to keep hammering this into you, right? I said it in the Winner Circle podcast this week. We don't play DFS to get action into play. We don't play DFS for entertainment. We play for edge. We want to find edge because there's money to be made. And the easiest money to be made is in props. If you are in a state with legal sports betting, we talk about this all the time. I cannot emphasize it enough. Last year, we were plus 250 units. That means that even if you just put $20 per bet, your expectation would have been plus $5,000 from that because there is edge in props. Prop lines are inefficient. They don't allow you to bet more than like $100 per prop bet most places. And if you're trying to bet more than that and you're consistently winning, they're going to limit your bets, right? So it's not like game lines where huge amounts of money are flowing in and some people are betting $1 million on a game, $500,000 on a game, and the sports books better make sure that they have a pretty good line or they're going to lose a lot of money. Prop bets get people in the door. They get people excited. Most people lose money on them anyway because they don't know what they're doing, or they put together too many parlays trying to make a bunch of money. And if you are just playing prop bets sharply, you are going to make money. And it's a lot of work, but you can do it. And here's the cool thing. You don't have to do the work. So I just wanted to show you guys like how the props channel works. If you are a Props Insider member, you can see this channel. If you're not, you can't see it. And then literally Reezy and Dank and Zandamir and the rest of the team just drop bets in here for you. So you don't have to do the research. You don't have to do the work. All you do is get the bets and place the bets. And then over time, profit, because we have a 2-year sample size of plus 350 units since we started this just over 2 years ago. So really want to encourage you. NBA is coming up, which is the start of the NBA season is typically our hardest season, but our hottest season, make the most money there. And so want to encourage you guys that if you're not in here, very much worth hopping in there. Grab a week pass week pass doesn't really give you a large enough of sample, especially during NFL season, but grab a month pass. At this point, that would take you through the start of NBA, I believe. And so you get the next several weeks of NFL, you get a little bit of MLB, you would get NBA. You don't have to know anything about these sports. You don't have to follow these sports. The bets just get dropped in there for you. You place the bets and you come out ahead, right? The track record is ridiculous on our end. So want to encourage you on that. I wanted to show you what that channel looks like. Okay, so last thing we do here is the bottom up build. This bottom up build gives us a chance to kind of see what's available from a salary saver standpoint. This week, there's not much, right? And then also gives us an opportunity to talk about just roster construction strategy. We build with a 44K salary cap. So not the 50K salary cap that DraftKings provides, but a 44K salary cap. And as always, we have the bottom-up build contest that always fills. We usually launch a second one. You can find that linked in the OWS Discord on the BUB contest channel, or you can find it linked in my player grid. The rules are simple. Play with a 44K salary cap. It's free. There are like real prizes for winning, real prizes being like edge points, which is actual money on the OWS site that can be used for courses and stuff. So yeah, hop in there, build a roster with a 44K salary cap or below. This week, I actually was really easy for me to build this bottom-up build. A lot of times I talk through like all the things that changed throughout the process of my bottom-up build. This week, I wanted to 44K salary cap and not a lot of great value on the slate. So I wanted to start with Derek Carr, who's one of the cheapest ways to access the upside of these top 3 game environments. Derek Carr, he's only thrown the ball 39 times. Well, he's also been way ahead every single game, right? And so if the Eagles are able to keep this game close and competitive throughout, this is an opportunity for Derek Carr to throw the ball 35 times. So even if the efficiency drops dramatically, and I went through in my DFS interpretations, strongly encourage you to read my DFS interpretations for this game, because I went through what we're seeing with the Saints offense, how real it is, why it's real or not real, what is expected to continue and what will be expected to fade, and so on and so forth. But a good spot for the Saints offense. And so Derek Carr and Rashid Shaheed and Dallas Goedert was my starting point for this roster. Dallas Goedert, who, everybody wants to be on Devontae Smith. And I think people are kind of forgetting about Dallas Goedert, where typically AJ Brown's out. That would be the first thought, is like, Goddard's going to see a big bump in targets as well. And I think that because he didn't hit last week, he's kind of just like slipping through the cracks for people. So Dallas Goedert and Rashid Shaheed and Derek Carr gives us an opportunity to access the upside of this game environment. The next thing I did was I was thinking about how I could do something a little bit differently at running backs. So running back's not typically where we try to separate from the field. We know that Jordan Mason will probably touch the ball 25 times this week, but we also know that he's probably not being targeted much. So max, he's going to see 1 catch, probably, maybe 2 catches. Maybe things break his way. He sees 2 catches. We know that Zach Charbonnet is going to be, he played 67 out of 70 snaps last week, and not a great north-south runner yet, but really good pass catching back. So we know he's going to get the pass catching work. We know that Seattle's they're probably not thrilled about the fact they have to use him as their early down running back, and he's not going to have a ton of efficiency more than likely in that area, but the pass game work gives him really high floor, and we know that he's going to get a lot of touches. Both those guys are super sharp plays, but there are paths to failure for them, or at least paths to not putting up the top running back scores in this price range. So with Jordan Mason, if he doesn't get the 100-yard bonus and or doesn't score a touchdown, all of a sudden he's a guy with 1 catch for 4 yards, and everything else is just how many yards did he get on the ground, right? So he could end up with an 8, 9, 10-point game if things break the wrong way for him there. And then with Charbonnet, what if the targets go from 5 or 6 down to 3, right? What if he only gets 3 or 4 catches this week, right? So then you pick up 6 or 7 points through the air. That's awesome. But what if he only rushes for 60 yards and fails to score a touchdown because he's not that great of a running back in terms of pure running back, north-south, getting every yard that he can on each individual run. He's kind of still looking for the home run swing type thing. And, at the NFL level, the biggest thing is just get those yards, because we're running the ball to stay ahead of the chains. We're running the ball to put ourselves in third and manageable, second and manageable, so that we can continue to pick up first downs and move the field. And so there's a very clear scenario in which Charbonnet picks up 6 points through the air, but then also only 6 points on the ground and ends with 12 points. So I'm going to have a ton of Charbonnet, a ton of Mason this week, but also going some other directions. So a couple guys in here, Tony Pollard, I think it's 19 and 22 touches in his first 2 games with the Titans. I don't know yet about Jordan Love playing, but if Jordan Love's right here on my phone. So listed as questionable and probably going to be a game time decision. So But if Jordan Love is out, you know that the Titans are going to have a plan for that Malik Willis all-out run game, right? And they're going to force Malik Willis to throw from the pocket. And then they're also going, if they can kind of slow down Malik Willis, which they should be able to do, right? Hey, we're going to sell out, stop the run. We're going to force him to beat us through the air. And we don't think he can do it. We don't think he can be a drop back passer and beat us. And then he probably can't be, right? So then that lowers the scoring on that side. And then the Titans are going to say, we're in control of this game. Will Levis has been like upsetting us to no end with these boneheaded decisions that he's making late in the games that are costing the Titans. Could be 2-0 right now. They absolutely should be 1-0. I mean, 1-1 at worst. And they could be 2-0. But he's kind of given away back-to-back games. He completely gave away the game against the Bears. And I mean, along with the blocked punt that the special teams had for the Titans, and then kind of blew things against the Jets as well in week 2, where the Titans were right there with the Jets. Either team could have won, and then Will Levis tossed the ball away and came to the sideline, and Brian Callahan asked him, what the F are you doing? And talked after the game about Levis's dumb decision-making, right? Like, it makes sense for them to say, look, Will Levis is like early career Josh Allen and not learning to stop making these mistakes. This week's game plan is let's slow down Malik Willis. Let's prevent the Packers from scoring points, and let's run the ball. I mean, you're still going to pass, right? But like, let's try to take stuff off of Will Levis's plate. So I think that Pollard's workload is very secure in this spot. And then DeAndre Swift, who has, Khalil Herbert hasn't been an issue stealing snaps and touches from DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift is operating as the guy. The problem is the Bears cannot move bodies with their offensive line. They cannot run the football. But this week they face a Colts team that, speaking of that old Seattle 3, that old tree of coaches, Dan Quinn adapted when he went to Dallas. And he was like, you know what, I'm going to change up my defense. I'm going to learn a lot of new things and really change the way that I call defenses. Gus Bradley has not done that. And last week, where everybody could have seen it coming, everybody knew that the Packers were just going to try to run the ball. And Gus Bradley was like, oh, so that's okay. We don't change what we're doing, right? And the Packers ran all over the Colts last week. So this week, definitely a chance for DeAndre Swift to finally break out a broad range of outcomes, but he has that like 6-point floor. He could have a 6-point DraftKings game, but he could also have a 30-point DraftKings game and be a separator. So getting him at low ownership in something like this, bottom-up build, where I would expect Mason and Charbonnet to be even over-owned relative to what they will be in normal contests, because now we're trying to save salary and you don't want to, these guys are cheap. They've got huge roles. It's kind of the first place a lot of people would look. Again, our bottom-up build is the only 44K salary cap contest that exists, and it's an OWS contest, and most people who've played have watched this show. So like that always skews ownership. But if we just zoomed out and said, what if there were a 44K salary cap contest? Where would ownership go? People would be flocking to these cheaper running backs to these big roles. And so getting something different there was a fun way to go. So Derek Carr, Tony Pollard, DeAndre Swift, Rashid Shaheed, and Dallas Goedert is the starting point here. Next thing I did on this roster was I threw in the Bears defense, a defense that I like this week at only 2,600. And then I threw in Devon Bailey. So Devon Bailey played about half of the Broncos snaps in week 1, had the larger share of the slot snaps than little Jordan Humphrey. He missed last week. Little Jordan Humphrey played like 51 snaps last week. Bailey's coming back this week. Bailey, 8 targets, 8 catches, 39 yards in week 1. So who is Bailey? First off, I think he's 27 years old. He's Mormon, so he did, a 2-year mission and then a redshirted, did a 2-year mission, then went to play college football and redshirted his first year. And so, way behind from an age standpoint, but that also means that he's that much further along, in terms of his development as a player. On those 8 targets, 2 of them were schemed plays for him. Another 1 or 2, he was the first read on the play. And then all but one of his other catches, he was the first check down option, right? So it was like, look downfield, it's not there, check it down to Bailey. So clearly a guy who Sean Payton likes. They're excited to get him back out there this week. And his career yard, he's 6'4". He's a big dude. His career yards per catch in college was, I think, over 13 yards per catch in college. So he's not just a short area guy. He can certainly hit for some big plays. Playing this Tampa team that nobody can run on, and the Broncos can't run, right? We saw last week the Lions against Tampa. So a decent shot at Bailey seeing some targets. He's only 3,400, frees up some salary, and allows us to close this out with Jameson Williams, who is way underpriced at 5,800, 9 and 11 targets through the first 2 games. I believe 1 carry in each game as well. in this great game environment against Arizona. And then wrapping it up with Deontay Johnson, who is going to be popular this week. I'm starting to come around on him as just a guy, like I think Andy Dalton's going to keep this offense on track. So not sexy, but a guy who can perform, can put up some points, and, can put up in this where we need to save salary, right? He can put up 4x his salary or even 5x if everything were to come together. So Deontay Johnson, 4,900 wraps this up, leaves us with exactly 6K in salary left over. Final roster. I'll read through it and then get us out of here. Derek Carr, Tony Pollard, DeAndre Swift, Rashid Shaheed, Devon Bailey, Deontay Johnson, Dallas Goedert, Jameson Williams, and the Bears defense. That does it for the Angles podcast. I got to get out of here because I have another show in 4 minutes. That's the Solo Ship pod, which I talked on the Winner Circle pod this week about what a valuable show that is. And Squirrel Patrol, who's by far one of the sharpest DFS players in the space. And it's about a 30-minute show. So you can find it on Roto Grinders, their podcast feed and their video stuff. But it's free, and you can throw it on 2x speed and catch it all in about 15, 17 minutes. So it's a great show. If you guys want to hop over there, I always pick up something valuable from Squirrel Patrol. Airs live. So actually this does not air live. So you will not hear this until after that has already aired, but future weeks airs live. So you can always check that out as well. But with that, I'm going to get out of here. I will see you on 1 week season, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.